what does Russia want and how should Europe respond, I think is the key question today. In the past, certainly Europe has always shown some unity with regard to the issue of sanctions, even though there were countries which were not much in favor of those sanctions. Those once enacted have been applied, and in a very, very diligent way also from those countries, namely Italy, given that we are here, who are not politically supporting those. So we always had this sort of confrontation between having sanctions for several the reasons that you all know, just the annexations of Crimea, etc. And on the other hand, to keep the dialogue on. So I think very much this is what it is at stake. Russia is there. Russia is an important interlocutor, and Russia is more and more playing an important role in the international scene. Are we disregarding this and keeping Russia in a corner, or rather do we think in a strategic way how we can engage or re-engage with Russia on different fronts? This is a question that I think will keep us busy also for the future. And on a different role, if you look at the conclusions at the communiqué of the G7, you can really, of the Taormina G7, the one that was held last month, where Italy had the presidency of the group of the 7, and you read the paragraph with regard to Ukraine and Russia, you can see this tension there. You can see this is the outcome of a compromise, and that this is the real question. But there are many questions that KADRI LIIK, in her commentary titled "What Does Russia Want?" are extremely thought-provoking and I think very much appropriate. I will just mention a few so we can then start the discussion with you, KADRI, perhaps. Everybody says that Russia is a challenge, but how to address this challenge is pretty much unclear and uncertain. So some of the questions that KADRI asks are, first of all, what does Russia want? Does it, for example, want to restore the Soviet Union? Start a socially conservative revolution in the West, because there are all these rumors that Russia is engaging with some parties, some groups, some movements, we don't know. Unify the Russian-speaking lands, this is very much an open question. Or even conclude a geopolitical deal with Donald Trump. So many questions which I find extremely important and interesting, and therefore I leave to KADRI the floor in order to expand on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Silvia, for introduction, and thank you, President, for hosting us here in that impressive building in beautiful Rome. Always pleasure to be here. And yes, we are here to discuss Russia. I focus on Russia for basically all my working life. That's more than 20 years now. Find it continuously fascinating and trying to understand what's happening in Russia, in Europe's relations with Russia, and why. And one aspect that has disturbed me is that there is very shallow understanding of what Russia is about and what Russia's so-called challenge is about. It depends on which country you read the newspapers, but you can see Russia being accused of all sorts of things. I mean, American debate these days is totally outlandish, but also elsewhere. So we all have classified Russia a problem ever since annexation of Crimea, even if not earlier. But we don't really discuss what's the nature of a problem. Where does Russia challenge us and how? What does Russia want? So I wrote about it. And Russia wants a different world order. I went through the other so-called pseudo-challenges that people often mention. Actually, one more could be brought into discussion, but I don't mention in my paper, but that's the safety of domestic regime. There is that view also that everything that Russia is doing abroad is in order to enhance Putin's popularity at home and secure re-election, secure the survival of the regime, and self-enrichment of members of the ruling elite. That aspect, I find, is there, but up to a point. And my view is that Russia's real wars or real geopolitical actions, such as annexation of Crimea, that is not motivated by domestic factors, but by foreign policy factors. In many other things, domestic factor indeed does figure a lot. And it's also discussion in Moscow. If you speak with people who analyze domestic politics in Moscow, many of them would say that it's all domestically motivated, whereas foreign policy observers say, no, there are other things behind it, and I think there is independent foreign political agenda. But that is not necessarily what we think it to be. A lot has been talked about Russia's support to populist parties in Europe. Putin met with Marine Le Pen in the Kremlin before the elections. Russia promotes socially conservative values, is openly against some liberal aspects, and that's why there is some thinking, not least in Europe, that Russia is for sort of social conservatism. I don't find that to be true. I mean, Russia itself is not very socially conservative. I'm not sure how many of you have been to Russia, but if you go to a nightclub in Moscow, that's not a place you would call conservative, definitely not. And also Mr. Putin himself, I don't think that he is socially conservative. He's conservative in other ways, but in the sort of social scale, his views I would describe as Soviet. And that is not easily placeable, because Soviet Union was a strange hybrid system. I mean, definitely homosexuality was despised, but then again, abortion was very widespread. So it's not easily placeable. And I also ask about territorial terms, because that is very often thought that Russia is seeking territorial expansion in uncritical ways and unlimited aims. I don't think that is true either. I don't think Russia is trying to restore the Soviet Union. They know it is not possible. I don't also think that Russia is trying to unify Russian-speaking lands. That was much talked about after annexation of Crimea, that the Kremlin indeed justified with Crimea being settled by Russians and having belonged to Russia, and it was a reunification of Russian-speaking peoples. And that really seemed to signal some kind of ethnocentric approach to foreign affairs. But actually that was one-off, and then that went away. And coming from Estonia myself, I can see that Russia's approach to Russian speakers in Estonia, and we have many, is purely instrumental. They are used for geopolitical aims. But geopolitical aims, indeed, I think Russia wants to do away with what has been called liberal international order of the post-Cold War era. It doesn't want to restore the Soviet Union, but it wants to replay its end in the sense that it wants to change the agreements and rules that became into force after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is not happy with international order where countries are free to choose their own alliances, and sphere of influence is clearly something that Russia does want in territorial terms. This is first and foremost in the countries that we call Eastern Neighborhood, Georgia, Ukraine, and the other four countries, part of Eastern Partnership Program. And Russia would like to have a say about these countries' relations with the West, to be an arbiter with veto rights there. So territorial aspect is there, but But I make the point that actually Russia's ambition goes much further than that. Russia is against humanitarian interventions, idea of regime change, concepts such as responsibility to protect, and that not only in its neighborhood, but basically everywhere. And its interference in Middle East is inspired, for example, exactly by those concerns. Russia is in Syria in order to preserve the state, Assad regime, and Syria's statehood. And idea that a disgraced president ought to leave is not something that Moscow likes at all, and Moscow thinks that Western policy has been quite disastrous. What to do about it? Well, I make the point that Russia thinks that Western liberal order is about to collapse anyway, because they don't see it as viable. They interpret the changes they have seen in Europe, such as Brexit, as signs that European worldview has to end. Life has returned more to nation states, to be conducted by nation states, and that's something that Moscow finds a lot easier. But also internationally, they don't think that Western policy in the Middle East has been very viable. And to be honest, one can understand them on that one, definitely. Even so, I don't think that Moscow's worldview is viable either. I mean, the idea that they can be dictating to Ukraine what Ukraine should do is in my view, also outlandish, because it is strange that Moscow does see society and its aspirations in the Middle Eastern context, where they manifest as national minorities or religious minorities. And there, indeed, Russia's policy knows how to take that into account. But they are completely blind to it in Ukraine, and they do not see that Ukrainian society has its own aspirations, which are not originally even of geopolitical kind. Ukraine has anti-corruption agenda, and that was behind the revolution, the Maidan revolution. So I do not think that what Moscow wants to have in the neighborhood is achievable in principle. And I think any agreement on that would expose Europe in a very bad manner. Russia would think that we have given it the right to rule in the neighborhood, but we actually we cannot deliver what we might be seeming to promise in such a case. We cannot tell the society not to rebel against corrupt elites that Moscow's power would inevitably rely on. And Moscow would blame us, Europe, for not living up to its promises. So I think we need to have a very clear conversation with Moscow about neighborhood. And sanctions are part of this conversation. And sanctions are shaping Moscow's views of Europe and what can be done in neighborhood with Europe factor in mind. Although I think we can win, so to say, our normative conversation with Russia if we reinvigorate the Western model and make it attractive again. And some of that seems to be happening in some corners of Europe. Moscow doesn't yet see it, but I hope they will. Because President Putin is a very practical person. He doesn't bow to pressure. That is a matter of pride to him, not to be dictated terms. But if he sees certain things as facts of life, then he will accommodate them. So if he sees that European Union is here to stay and European worldview is about to be a factor in global politics, he will take that into account and accommodate his own approach. If we just keep telling him that, you need to listen to us, that doesn't do the trick. You need to prove yourselves with deeds. And that, of course, takes a long time. And especially in the concrete conflict with Ukraine, it would also take Ukraine to demonstrate its viability as a country, which Moscow also doesn't see, and which also will take a long time for Moscow to start seeing. So I have also been thinking that this relationship boils down the sort of staying power concept. We are trying to prove to ourselves, Moscow, to Americans now, that European way of life is something that can be sustained. And others, Moscow is trying to prove to us that there are other and better ways. So that is a long standoff and not really, I mean, it takes sort of whole societies and big process to get somewhere with that. It's not something one political leader can accomplish or diplomats. So how to conduct Russia policy meanwhile? And here, my view is that we Europeans ought to have a much more deeper going conversation about Russia among ourselves. What informs our views of Russia? Because there are national experiences that shape our thinking. I mean, there is a reason why Germany has been believing in engagement, because that worked for them. With East Germany, Ostpolitik was considered a success, and they tried to work that way also with Russia. And then they turned into different views because, yet again, I think annexation of Crimea awoke other historical echoes in Germany's mind, and they know what such actions can lead to. But also other countries have their experiences. I sometimes think of Estonia and Finland. I believe our analysis of Russia is pretty much identical, but our policy prescriptions are different. And Finland believes in very sort of quiet and calm behavior. Some call it even self-censorship. And that is because being very quiet is preserved as having preserved the country for Finland during the Cold War. Whereas for Estonia, independence came when everyone started speaking their mind. I mean, perestroika was all about calling spade a spade 1,000 times over. So in Estonian experience, naming and shaming is the first step towards correcting ills. And that's the instinct of policymakers, that this is the way to go. So I think we should look more into those sorts of experiences, because that would make us understand one another a lot better. And deeper going trust, I think, would allow us to make our policies more flexible. Because right now, many policies, be it sanctions or dialogue, they are based on fairly rigid consensus. They are a sort of trade-off. And I was in Berlin just the other evening, and German diplomats suggested that, in order to influence Russia's behavior in Ukraine, we get upgrade sanctions, downgrade sanctions, play with them, make them a flexible tool. I don't think right now that is possible. I think that if someone wanted to upgrade sanctions, many people in this town would stand up and say, under no circumstances. If someone wanted to downgrade sanctions without anything happening, many people in Northern Europe would be up in arms. So we don't have that sort of flexibility. And likewise with dialogue, there are many who dispute dialogue as such. And we haven't thought through what can be achieved with dialogue. We are sort of fetishizing dialogue as an end in itself, that somehow in itself accomplishes something good. So I think that in order to make our policies really more usable in a more flexible manner, a lot more in terms of common understanding and trust would be needed. And my dream remains that if we manage to combine our various national experiences, and there is really a variety of them in the European Union, if we could manage to combine them into common policy, then that would be a wealth and power indeed.
Ian, what's your take on the current situation between Europe and Russia, and I would say also the United States? I mean, it's quite complex.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Thank you very much, SIOI and ECFR for the occasion of discussion. I very much agree with the main observation of the paper, that Russia is actually acting in a way that is aiming to disrupt the liberal world order. It's nothing new. It is a consequence also of the way international politics is structured since the fall of the Berlin Wall. the idea that the world should converge to a post-liberal order, similar in every part of the world for all the countries, was an illusion. We are seeing it now. I mean, it's not only a matter of the so-called emerging powers, the fact that they want to challenge the post-liberal world order. Now it is also a matter of politics inside the Western world. And sometimes this politics wins in certain countries. Sometimes they also win in important states. And we have a big reshuffling of international equilibria and international relations. So I think Russia is not acting outside of a pattern that we see in other different countries. I mean, this idea that KADRI explains very well of wanting 6 countries around Russia to act as a buffer for Russia is something that Russia does, but it's similar, very similar to the pattern that, for example, Iran is following in the Middle East. So it is a pattern followed by different world powers in this reorganization of power in a regional order that we should take into account. But I'd like to reverse a little bit the question of the paper, that is, what Russia wants and how we respond to that. Because I think, of course, Russia is a challenge, but it is a challenge not because of what Russia wants, which, as I explained, is not only what Russia wants, but also other world power want or try to desire. But Russia is a challenge because we, as in Europe, don't know what we want. And we act responding to what other international actors want. That's the main reason, in my opinion, why Russia is a challenge. I know that with President Frattini, probably we don't agree completely with the analysis of the relationship we should have with Russia, but I do agree with the fact that we need to have a dialogue. Of course, we need to have a dialogue as Europe with all international actors, and we are weak in this having a dialogue because we don't know what to say. We don't know what our position is. This is very extremely clear in the Syrian case. The Syrian case is something that shows the fact that regional actors are very clear on their aims, and I think mainly about Iran, I think mainly about Turkey, I think mainly about Russia, which are all perceived as being a challenge for international politics. But the problem is that as Europe, we suffer the results of a crisis, we pay. I mean, the European Union, both at the level of the Commission and at the level of the Member States, is the first contributor to the humanitarian emergency in Syria. We have suffered, and we're still suffering a lot from the flow of refugees and the way this flow of refugees is reshuffling internal politics within Europe. We do suffer from all these effects, but we don't realize how to have a true role over there. What we want, what kind of world order we should promote, and how to do it, with what instruments. So the real challenge, in my opinion, is within us and not outside us. And this is very ironic because this uncertainty is less uncertain the closer you are to Russia. President Frattini knows because we met last week during a mission that the Foreign Affairs Committee was having in Estonia and Norway. It was very surprising to find in Estonia a very strong stance for Europe as an answer to the challenges surrounding that small country. That country, we in Italy here, we tend to think that those countries that enter the European Union recently, that are from Eastern Europe, are countries that are less Europhiles and less committed to the European process. We were very surprised to find every interlocutor, from the President of the Parliament to the President of the Republic to the Prime Minister, saying we want to drive further the European integration process because we know that the challenges we have here in the geographical position, the geopolitical position of our country is we need Europe more than anything. The farthest you are from Europe, the more from Russia, the more difficult it is, to an extent, paradoxically, to find a reason of existence of our own world. And I think we should reflect more on this, on what we want, on what instruments to use in order to get our world influence, rather than reflecting on the challenges posed by others. This is mainly what I wanted to say, and I hope that it can spark a little bit of debate.
I'm giving the floor to Ian Bond, and you, by the way, Ian, besides being with the Center for European Reform as Director of Foreign Policy, as I said before, you served the British diplomatic service for 28 years. So I don't know if you want to build from on what Leah has said, perhaps in the specific case of the United Kingdom, but definitely what we can say that, about the United Kingdom is that it has always had pretty much a strong stake on Russia. So the floor is yours, Ian.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Silvia, and thank you very much to ECFR for bringing me here to Rome. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was thinking it's about a decade since I was last here, and it looks just as good as it did the last time. Various scenarios for the breakdown of European policy towards Russia and how to avoid them, which I would also recommend. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into them because it's a rather speculative paper, but I think it reaches some very good conclusions about the importance of sticking together and working together and not losing interest in Ukraine and the other parts of the former Soviet Union. I basically want to say that I think there were 4 things in KADRI's paper that I agreed with and 4 things that I disagreed with. Actually, I probably agreed with more than 4, but I want to highlight 4. The first is, I agree that Russia wants to revert to a world of nation states and to escape from the liberal international order as it has worked for the last 60 or more years. The second point is that I think Russia is waking up to the disadvantages of President Trump. They were delighted when he was elected, and they have started to realize that he's rather a mixed blessing. The third point is our problems with Russia do start with our problems with ourselves. It's the weaknesses that we show that are the problem. And linked to that, one of the advantages that we have is that Russia has a love-hate relationship with the West. For all that Putin and those around him perceive the West as a threat, they also find many things there that they enjoy. The things I disagree with, I think Putin believes that he can flourish in a Hobbesian world, in the war of all against all. I think he believes in the ideological conservatism and in the concept of a Russian world, a Ruski mir, more than KADRI implies. And I disagree with her on the extent to which Russia still takes a legalistic approach to foreign policy. I would have agreed with that based on my foreign office experience up until about, I suppose, the war in Georgia. After that, I think things changed. So starting off with the liberal international order, I think it's entirely rational for a country in Russia's position to try to overturn the existing order. Russia is essentially a country in decline. Its economy remains grossly over-dependent on hydrocarbons. The various efforts that have been made to reform the economy have been half-hearted and unsuccessful. And if the if the existing order continues, the only thing that is going to happen to Russia is that it is going to lose further ground to its international competitors. So it seems to me that a logical strategy in those circumstances is to look at the unfavorable position that you are on the chessboard and overturn it. Linked to that, I believe that Putin sees Russia as well placed in a more Hobbesian world, not because Russia has more assets than anybody else, but that if you are surrounded by large herbivores like the European Union and the United States under Obama, being a medium-sized predator can bring you many benefits. Where I think this is breaking down is with Trump, but I'll perhaps come back to him. Again, linked to this, when Russia was weak, it was extremely legalistic about its foreign policy. I used to call on the man who was negotiating the Estonian-Russian border in the Russian Foreign Ministry in the early 1990s, who had an enormous pile of ancient maps which he would use at great length to explain why it was that the border should be a few meters in this direction rather than that direction. Everybody else thought that basically the deal was there to be done, but the Foreign Ministry legal department was absolutely determined that it was not going to give up an inch of territory that had once been Russia's. That changed, I believe, after, well, possibly after Kosovo. I mean, in the case of the independence of Kosovo, I thought the Russians had at least an arguable case at the International Court of Justice for saying that Kosovo's independence was not in accordance with international law. But once they had lost there, then they basically had no case at all for saying, in the case of Georgia and the enclaves which Russia then recognized as independent states, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, basically their argument was, well, you did it first. That's not a good legal argument. And that became even stronger in the case of Crimea. Now, Trump, I think, has upset Putin's calculation of who wins from disruption, because rather bizarrely, Trump, in the most powerful nation on earth, perceives America as being much worse than much weaker than it actually is, and therefore believes that he also has to pursue a strategy of disruption. And in a situation where you have two disruptors, that sort of predator advantage that Putin has had up until now seems to me to be disappearing. I'm quite prepared to admit that Putin uses ideological conservatism quite cynically. I think his spirituality is a shirt that he puts on and takes off quite easily. But I do think it's worth reading the 2015 Russian National Security Strategy, which has a number of references to the revival of Russian traditional spiritual and moral values and the threat posed to them by Western non-governmental organizations and so on. And it's also worth taking a look at the website of the Ruski Mir Foundation, which is a kind of a governmental, non-governmental organization in Russia which aims at preserving links with the Russian diaspora. And it is very strong on the importance of Russians, ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, people who identify with Russia in other countries, turning to serving Russia, providing some sort of service to Russia. So it seems to me that he does actually want to instrumentalize the Russian community beyond his borders. I don't think that means the recreation of the Soviet Union, but I do think that it implies the development of a lot more influence outside Russia's borders. And I do think that Putin keeps pretty close ties to people who promote these sorts of ideas. It's not just the sort of slightly cranky Mr. Dugin, but also Vladimir Yakunin, who was the railways minister and one of Putin's closest allies, who was a big backer of orthodox causes and a link between the Russian traditionalists and the extreme right in Western Europe. And I think the conservative, the social conservative ideology serves a purpose for Putin of uniting the Russian world, but dividing the West between the liberals and the conservatives. Now, at some point in almost every discussion on Russia, one comes to one of the classic Russian questions, and one of them is always, "Что делать?" What is to be done? It seems to me that the answer to that is in the last 2 points on my list of things that I agreed and disagreed with KADRI on. The first is about our weaknesses. You can only drive wedges if there are gaps in which to drive them. So it seems to me that unity, through dialogue, no question, we should be talking to each other a lot more, but unity in the West is more important than it's ever been. And it's also about unity within countries. I mean, the fact is, there are a lot of people who are feeling left behind. That's generally not down to underlying flaws in the liberal international order. It's down to bad policy choices made by governments. You know, the British government did not have to choose to underinvest in infrastructure in the north of England so that it became, from being the kind of industrial powerhouse of the UK, an increasingly neglected and isolated area. That's something we could fix for ourselves. So I think there's a lot that we can do to strengthen our own unity. And the last thing is that we need to exploit this very conflicted view that Putin and those around him have of the West, that it is a love-hate relationship. You know, the Russian elite are people who keep their mistresses, their families, their money in the West. They own much of the best property in London. They happily launder their money through Cyprus, Latvia, the City of London, wherever they can. That gives us leverage if we choose to use it. There are limits to which they are not prepared to go in order to break the relations with us, and there is more damage that we can do to their business model than we have so far been prepared to do. I don't think we should either overestimate Russia's strengths or underestimate our own. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. President Frattini, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for hosting us here. It's always a pleasure to be here at SIOI. The floor is yours if you want to comment on this.
Yes, thank you very much. It has been a really very interesting discussion. Thanks, Silvia, for proposing to us to organize for the European Council of Foreign Affairs here at SIOI such a very timely occasion of debate. You have been listening to the speakers, and you will have realized that opinions are different. My opinion will be different from the one of other speakers, except from the one expressed by Leah, when she said, and this is my first point, my departure point, the problem, we have a problem at home, not in Moscow. We have a problem of European weakness, of European incapacity to have a real common view on foreign policy in general terms and on the what to do vis-à-vis the Russian Federation. We have a problem of weakness in promoting and defending really well-integrated European policies, not only on immigration, not only on common defense, but I think on energy security. These are all fields where if Europe is weak, we are doing not all what it is in the primary interest of Europe as a whole, but often, unfortunately, we follow what others indicate to us. I've been criticizing some American decision where American openly put the pressure on Europe, appealing to the transatlantic loyalty, and in the name of transatlantic loyalty, a country like Italy, where there had been always a policy in favor of cooperating instead of sanctioning Russia, accepted in the name of loyalty. But we have been paying the price. We pay the price as economy, Italy. We pay the price as playing a role as Europe and within Europe. And so we made some mistakes on that. I said, frankly, knowing that you will not agree with me on that, but this is my firm opinion. This is exactly what happened always with my colleagues and friends from London, always with my colleagues from Jack Straw to David Miliband to William Hague. We disagreed first on Russia, and this is normal. But finally, we've been able to find common ways of cooperation and dialogue, even though positions were extremely different. The same is for other countries, not particularly Estonia, I would say, but I would mention Poland. We had always different points of view. But it's not concerning only Italy. I remember very well, around the table of the Council of Foreign Affairs, they used to have 3-4 different points of view about this or that behavior on Russia or Russian behavior vis-à-vis Europe. So one of the key points is let's keep unity among European member states. And what is missing on that? We have to be frank. Political, frank dialogue is missing. When I look at recent decision to simply renew or postpone or expand the scope in some cases, or the current sanction timing when it's decided to have more sanction or again sanction for the next 12 months, it is done very frequently, as you know, in A point. A point is one of the ways where the Council approves with no discussion. Simply, let's take or leave it. There is a technical preparation. The text is submitted to the Council. A point, take or leave it. Is it possible to decide about sanctions in A point with no political discussion? Why is that? Because there is awareness that in case of deep political discussion, there will be as many divergences that we note when we address immigration. So it is unfortunately the will to avoid addressing directly the problems where we are aware we have different points of view. So my appeal is, first of all, to avoid to be, I would say, reluctant to engage among us. And let divergences emerge, because in that way we can try to mitigate divergences and to regain strength. As Leah said, it's absolutely necessary. And to extend sanctions also to those that in Europe are having business on the Nord Stream project. What has been the reaction? Extremely tough. Negative reaction from Chancellor Merkel, who has been one of the protagonists of encouraging or urging all of us to accept sanctions, but now she was the first to react. Why? Because Nord Stream is a vital interest strategic project on energy security for Germany. And the same has been done from Austria, reacting negatively to the simple perspective to extend sanctions to the area, to the sector of energy security in Europe. And what happened in Washington? There was a reaction from the Chamber of Representatives to say there is no agreement. Let's not consider as taken for granted what you have proposed as American administration led by President Trump. And so there was, for the first time, even from within the American Parliament, a reaction where they said, let's forget to simply put on the table a take-or-leave proposal to extend sanctions further. So these are symptoms that something is changing in the perspective of the international community that, as all have said, dialogue is absolutely essential, but the spirit of dialogue should be based on trust and not on mistrust, which is the case, unfortunately, is a mutual distrust, in my view. I will not say that Russia is trusting Europe, but there is, we like or not, is a matter of fact, mutual mistrust, and it is absolutely difficult to have a dialogue based on that. What does Russia want? I remember my personal experience when I was not yet foreign minister. I was the Secretary General of the government of Italy. It was 1994. The Italian G7 presidency took a strategic political decision. It was the worst time for the Russian Federation immediately after the dissolution, when President Yeltsin was considered as a pariah in the international community. Italy presidency invited Russia to attend to G7 and give birth to the G8. We gave Russia a sign of confidence and a sign of understanding. What KADRI said about importance of understanding is absolutely essential. For Russia, understanding and to be understood is very important. In the worst moment of the recent history, we gave them a sign that we did not consider that the historical, national, traditional pride of Russia had been dissolved simply because of dissolution of Soviet Union. This was, in my view, a message of understanding. This is one of the reasons why we have been keeping so close relations with the Russian Federation. It is not by case that President Putin and President Bush, who has not been the best friend of Russia, accepted to shake hands here in Italy and to decide to establish NATO-Russia Council under the Italian government proposal. Because we tried to propose a model based on mutual trust. They believed in that and they accepted. There have been a deterioration of things after that, it's undeniable, but now what is necessary is simply not to dismiss the appeal from President Putin. I don't agree at all with those that consider with criticism the fact that President Putin wants to keep historical tradition, culture, religion, why not, of Russia. My question is addressed to myself, to our Europe. Why is Europe unable to keep its identity, its culture, its roots? So instead of criticizing Putin, let's be stronger on that as well as on other fields that have been mentioned. So also keeping identity, defending historical pride of our culture should be one of the goals for the Europe of today, and unfortunately it is not. It is put in question, it is put in doubt, and in the same time we criticize Putin because he is very firm on defending Russian tradition and Russian values. In conclusion, what to do? Of course, I have not the possibility to say what is necessary to do. I say what should be, in my view, in our interest, speaking as European. In our interest, it should be necessary to consider Russia as a strategic partner where we have a strategic common interest to defeat common threats. It is not because of sanctions, because of, as has been said, downgrading or upgrading sanctions that Russia will fully implement Minsk agreement. I don't think so. It is because of our capacity to have an open dialogue, a constructive dialogue, not to threaten further sanctions, because if it is true that Russia is going through difficult economic time, it is also true that, in my view, Russia has the capacity to recover quite rapidly. So don't have illusions. Russian economy will not be destroyed rapidly. They have a capacity to get links and ties on the East, first of all, on China. But what is our interest? Fighting terrorism. How is it possible to fight terrorism if Russia is not around the table? In the broader Middle East, in Syria, for our interest in Libya. How is it possible to succeed if we don't appeal to the constructive cooperation of Russia through the leverage Russia has on President of Egypt, who has a leverage on General Haftar? Without General Haftar on board, never there will be a government of national unity in Libya. So we have an interest to bring together all the players to help solving the crisis in Libya as well as in Syria. How is it possible to talk about Iran one day saying we have to put in discussion the current 5+1 agreement, and then to say, oh, Russia and Iran have an agreement, so we are preoccupied. But the day before, we said we have to defend the agreement with Iran. But the simple fact that Russia, Turkey, and Iran get an agreement, we are concerned. We shouldn't be concerned. We should get them closer to us, not to keep the distance, because the interest is a common interest to stabilize broader Middle East. We have no interest at all to inflame the crisis between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. On the contrary, if there is a possibility to mediate, we have to encourage all the attempts. You know that yesterday the King of Saudi Arabia appointed Prince Mohammed bin Salman as a crown prince. And it is not a secret. Mohammed bin Salman is keeping close contact with the Russian Federation, not only with President Trump administration. Why? Because they realize Russia can be a viable partner in that region. So for all these reasons, I can say the visit of President Gentiloni to President Putin recently was a very good sign, in my opinion. It was the reconfirmation that Italy wants to play once again the role, not a bridging role, I don't like the word bridge, but the role of serious, critical but strategic interlocutor with the Russian Federation. Europe has been keeping such a role for years and years, and the reconfirmation shown by Prime Minister Gentiloni was a good sign immediately before the G7, where Russia unfortunately couldn't be invited. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, going back, you mentioned several times the G7. Perhaps this one was the most meaningful G7 we have had since a long time, in the sense that for once nothing was pre-cooked by the Sherpas, but several issues were still on the table, and the leaders could have the opportunity to discuss among themselves politically, of course, and also to say we disagree on this. And we have to face the reality. And I think also that, I mean, a pre-cooked document within the European Council do not make Europe any stronger. Actually, they built mistrust, because receiving something that is already pre-cooked, it doesn't really imply your own engagement. So but maybe it's for another panel, we can reconvene on that. Definitely, I think there is anyway some common line within the disagreements that we have had today, and is, first of all, understanding each other, and secondly, trying to build or rebuild trust. How we do it, we can have different views, and I have to say that our panelists have been very disciplined, so we do have some time for questions.
Yes, I have heard everything about the connections between Russia and Europe, but we have forgotten probably one point. China is now practically the other logical interpreter of the foreign policy in the world, and China has invited Putin and the Italian Prime Minister in China to develop the One Road, One Belt. That means the development of China and all the Silk Road up to Rome and Venice. Europe should be taken in this consideration. Not only Italy, but Italy could be the mentor of this new policy towards the development of the area of the Silk Road. Thank you very much.
I'm Ambassador of Finland in Rome. And now we can return, hi, my old colleagues. I can return to the
I didn't recognize you behind the beard, actually.
Yeah, I had more hair here and less here. But I have 3 quick points to make. First of all, I think there is a strong unanimity that we need more commonality, we need stronger EU action and common action. And I think we all subscribe to that point, and that's very clear. My second point is something that I felt there's a straddling between where we are on the ideology and history question, and I think that is an interesting question when you deal with Russia, because I think you cannot take the ideology out of the equation, and I think history is very crucial, because I think it's very natural, it's important that every country is proud of its history and identity, but at the same time there should be an open discussion about the history, and that is the problem in Russia right now, that you don't have a very open discussion of history and culture. I feel a bit pity that the great country, the great culture, is actually becoming diminished through this kind of very strict lens of what is Russia, what is culture, what is the history. So I think it is, as a result, the Russian society become poorer through this very simple reading of history. My final third point concerns, and I would like to join others who have addressed the question about the Russian activities in Europe and other places connected to the elections. I think Kadri made the point that was Ian, that Russia is understood better closer to Russia. But now we have the issue that Russia is much more active, much more further away from the borders. And I think that is quite preoccupying, because the countries that are not used to this kind of activity have been put on the limelight on this. And I think my question is, how does that will change the equation on your sense, and also bringing my final credo that, of course, as a Finland, we are neighbors of Russia, we will be always their partners, we will always for dialogue, but it could be difficult sometimes, especially if the partners at the same time involves in activities that are contrary to the norms that we have agreed together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. There are two questions here.
I'm an Italian diplomat, and I thank you all for the very inspiring event. It triggers many questions. I will ask only one about the OSCE. I think this is another aspect we should be considering. It will be chaired by Italy next year, as you know. And my question is straightforward. What could the OSCE do, or in European terms, what could the European Union want out of the OSCE for the dialogue and the relations between the EU and Russia? Thank you.
Another one here. And
Paolo Calzini of Johns Hopkins SIOI Europe. Excuse me if I don't stand. I have two basic questions. The first, to KADRI LIIK. I would say that one of the main problems, both psychological and political, is the aspiration of Russia to be a regional great power. In the sense that to have an influence in the neighborhood is the precondition, exactly to what you said, to have a fundamental role in the new, so to say, post-liberal order. How do we assess that? And second, do you see, this is a very awkward question and I know you have an answer, how do you think the neighborhood between Russia and Europe, which in my opinion is a main problem in the European-Russian relation, beside other psychological, and especially the question of Ukraine, of course, by now, how do you think, I mean, I know that the term is a little provocative, that one can find a middle ground, not finlandization, the idea of integration, as you know, in a sense to make, at least economically, a middle ground between the two things. Third, to Jan Bon, because I don't agree, you said we have a leverage with the oligarch in the West. But if we bet on the oligarch, we really perpetuate one of the elements of corruption and non-reform. And it seems to me, aside from an ethical point of view, it would be a very bad political choice. Thank you.
thank you.
Now that India and Pakistan have become part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and maybe Turkey in the next year could become also part of it, do you think that this organization could be a way to challenge the liberal order, and could this organization allow China and Russia to have a more important role on the global stage? Thank you.
That is a really hard topic for someone like me, because it is very hard to know what actually is happening. There are so many rumors, many exaggerated media reports, and true information usually only emerges much later. For a long time, it's held by special services, and I hope it's even there, because I guess in some countries maybe information is scattered in different agencies and never goes together into a true picture. Nonetheless, we try to look at it. I'm working on another paper on Russian-European relations that is exactly designed to explore European weaknesses vis-à-vis Russia-European vulnerabilities, and not least exactly on that front of influencing via media and the political parties. And the good thing is that 2016 seems to have served as a wake-up call in much of Europe, because things that happened that year, the Lisa case in Germany, I'm sure you know, but fake news about Russian girl allegedly raped by refugees, which turned out totally not to be true. and the whole thing that's happening in America. And it seems that, I mean, Democratic National Convention really was hacked by someone connected to Moscow. Many other things that are spoken maybe didn't happen, but it's already a good thing. Although the trick, of course, is that when it comes to Russia's interference, you need awareness, but you do not need, you need exactly the right amount of awareness, not too much of it. We are also in danger of misinterpreting events in Europe as all connected to Russia. I remember in December there were elections in Bulgaria and Moldova and government change in Estonia, and all were interpreted as victories for Russia, whereas it's not. I mean, hardly any national election is related to Russia. There is local agenda that matters. And Estonia's government change was not political at all, in my view. That was all about relationships. So we need to read our own countries better as well. Because, you know, these issues that influence elections, they point to real vulnerabilities. They point to real problems in the society. And these make people vote one way or other. And if we think that it was all of Russia's meddling that brought the bad ones, in our view, to victory, then we just miss the real problems. And we fail to address them. And we aggravate the situation. We don't fix the real problem that way. So it's important not to also overinterpret it. Then I spent a week in Moscow in May, and I was trying to see, you know, how much can you learn from Russians? How do they conceptualize their interference in European affairs? How do they view it? Because that's often, you know, we say Putin thinks that. And actually Putin's thinking you can digest from his speeches. A lot is there, yes. But how is it instrumentalized? How is it coordinated? I've tried to learn something. And the picture that emerges is that it's not that well coordinated. I mean, there are some operations that really are very well coordinated. Takeover of Crimea was brilliant in terms of execution. And, but that is rare. So normally, what they are doing is rather sort of improvised collection of activities by various agencies that are linked by ideological background that classifies the West as an adversary. And political parties, my view is that Russia prefers mainstream political parties wherever it can. I was looking at the case of Austria. I mean, there are long-standing links between FPÖ and Moscow, but they never went quite mainstream. I mean, FPÖ got its cooperation agreement with United Russia only in this late November, so like a week before a presidential election that could have could have brought Hofer to presidency. So basically, it's Russia's means to use the cleavages in societies, vulnerabilities that there are, but it's not like Russia necessarily wants to bring one or other political force into power. And I think Russia will tailor its interference country by country, depending on its goals in a country, its linkages to mainstream parties, how it views the overall relationship, and what can be achieved by interfering, although the goals of the latter are not necessarily always very well defined. Vivian, I think I won't go into much detail here. We can discuss our differences over Russia at dinner. But yeah, I see Putin's agenda as much more sort of hard power geopolitical as opposed to populist, real conservatism and so forth. But of course, Russia promoting its culture and values, you know, I wish Russia trusted more its culture and values, as the ambassador said, because in a way, what it boils down to is that Russia's need to threaten the neighborhood and behave as a bully. It doesn't trust its natural attractiveness that would be there if Russia didn't try to force its neighbors to friendship. Real friendship can never be forced, and trying to force it basically makes sure there is no real friendship. if they just trusted their own attractiveness, that is undoubtedly there, things in the neighborhood would be different. Neighborhood is a hard question. I don't know how to, because I see a real dichotomy there. I mean, countries either have a right to apply for organizations or they don't. I don't see room for compromise on that one. And for us, it boils down really how to identify our own values, our own order, and so forth. So there is no easy way forward, and I think only time will tell eventually. So I think I will finish here, except, yeah, we need to talk more, and I agree, there ought to be deeper conversation, either on council level or somewhere below, because we ought to know one another's positions better. Even I really liked what Leah said, but it's also a surprise to me that you are surprised that Estonia is pro-European, because to me, of course it is. How else?
Okay, thank you very much, Leah.
Very on the question with meddling with the EU parties, I think the main aim, of course, for Russia doing that is to weaken our unity as European Union. How to react to that and what will happen with the Italian elections? Of course, there have been reports about a relationship between Russia and the Five Stars movement on the one hand and the Northern League on the other hand. I think the true thing, the true question, which is a true question also in the US, is to what extent our public opinion thinks that having a relationship, structured relationship with United Russia is a threat to national security, either like Italian national security or European unity. My feeling is that in the EU public opinion and in the Italian public opinion, it is not clear, as it used to be, that there are allies and that there are other countries. I mean, the feeling that I have is that some parties are friends with Germany, some other parties are friends with Russia, but who stands with the Italian people? That's the cue. And so it is up to us, politicians of different political parties, of different political ideas, to explain that one thing is a dialogue, and it can also be a very frank dialogue, like what, for example, Emmanuel Macron had with Putin when Putin was in Versailles, or what Angela Merkel keeps having with Putin. So one thing is talking about differences. I very much agree with what Franco Frattini said before. And another thing is looking at strongmen as the solution for all problems. This is not clear in the eyes of our public opinion, and we should try to make it clearer that we need alliances, we need dialogue, we need frank dialogue. They are different. A country like Italy can have all of these instruments, but having a structured relationship with the United Russia is something different, because the national interest of Russia sits in a different way from our national interest.
Thank you very much.
With Donald Trump's attacks on, particularly on the international economic order, on the World Trade Organization and so on, and with Xi Jinping's Davos speech and his speech at the opening of the Belt and Road Forum, that actually China is almost becoming a defender of the liberal international economic order. Now, you know, on the political side, on human rights questions, that's a different issue altogether. But in terms of looking after the economic order, suddenly Europe finds itself unexpectedly on the same side as China. Where does Russia fit into that? I mean, that's quite a complicated question. The year before last, I was in Beijing, and the word that a number of Chinese experts used about Russia's foreign policy was that Russia was reckless. That you know, Russia did things which were not well considered, and that were rather dangerous. And they contrasted this with China's approach. Now, I think they probably exaggerate how cautious China is when you look at some of the things it's done in the South China Sea. But I do think that China is not automatically the ally of Russia in all of Russia's foreign policy adventures. And just on the question of the Shanghai Organization, I mean, it does seem to me that actually the fact that both India and Pakistan have been brought into the Shanghai Organization without any progress in resolving the dispute between them means that the Shanghai Organization is not taken seriously by its existing members. I'm sorry to say that, but it seems to me that no organization that took itself seriously would want to import such a fundamental conflict without putting pressure on the two parties to resolve their differences. Other than that, I will say that I agree very strongly with Jan Atalas on the lack of a debate on history in Russia. If you contrast the lack of debate, and indeed, if anything, the closing down over the last 20 years of the debate on the role of Stalin, with the pained debates that have gone on in Germany about how Germany came to be the way it was, it's a really illustrative contrast. Oh, sorry, the oligarchs. I have to pick up the oligarchs because that was directed very much to me. I absolutely do not want to give the oligarchs license, but it seems to me that since I can't turn Russia into a democracy, one of the few areas of leverage that certainly the UK has is through the oligarchs who spend so much of their time in London, in the West, have financial interests there. And at the moment, we prefer to take the money and to ask no questions. I'd actually like to see us using the leverage more. It's probably a rather, it makes it sound a slightly sort of criminal enterprise to do it that way. But it seems to me that we have very few other levers at the moment.
I want to say, as Leah said, I don't think, frankly speaking, that Italian voters will vote under the influence of Putin. The Italian voters will be because they will be preferring this or that political party depending on the proposal they put on the table. So, frankly speaking, I would highlight the high value of a normal democracy, what Italy is, and I don't think this kind of influence. It can be true that some entities can exploit weaknesses, vulnerabilities, but the point is how to remove vulnerabilities. And this is the responsibility of Italian political parties, not because the points are made from Moscow. If the problem exists, the problem has to be solved for the good of Italians, not because there is an influence from outside Italy. The same applies to the incoming German election. In my personal view, since Russia considers very rightly Germany as the key player in Europe, and usually when you want to have a deal, you should have a deal with a strong interlocutor and partner. I think they don't have interest to have a weak Germany, but to have maybe Chancellor Merkel again in office for another term to go ahead with the cooperation, with the dialogue that has been established by Chancellor Merkel with President Putin. So I don't see the interest to destabilize a country like Germany, which is the only one maybe that can be a viable interlocutor in the absence, as it should do, of the European institution playing as a whole. In Minsk, you have seen Chancellor Merkel and President of France instead of Europe, as it should have been happened in a normal way of Europe-Russia cooperation. The other point is OSCE. Nobody said about that. I attach the greatest importance to OSCE. In my capacity of foreign minister, I've been working by strengthening, because I saw during the burning crisis with Georgia, with the mission of OSCE on the borders between Abkhazia, Ossetia, and Georgia, working so well to try to reassure the population on the territory and so on and so forth. So I strongly wish that the Italian presidency of OSCE will play a role in Caucasus, in Georgia, in that area, and of course on trying to implement in full what has been promised and said in Minsk agreement on that OSCE. OSCE can have a role, fantastically important role, on trying to get a solution to the crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh. That is another area where instability is dangerous for the whole region of the Caucasus. So OSCE and the Italian role is quite important. A final word on Silk Road and China. So far, we have seen important initiative undertaken by China on the Silk Road, proposals made to Russia, the interest shown by Italy, naturally. What has been the reaction from the European institution? Opposition, mainly opposition, reluctant, doubts, problems, obstacles, and on the substance, opposition, instead of, again, opening a dialogue on this extraordinary big plan of investment. You know perfectly that China decided to change or to integrate the original route of Silk Road that has been planned to pass through the sea from the south, to have another northern route passing through the Russian territory, exactly because of that kind of agreement in principle in Russia. Is it possible that Europe is outside of the game, is not intending to have a role and to participate when it is true? Transnational infrastructural projects are in a situation, in a very poor implementation situation. What about the fate of the corridors? People have been talking about the corridors, trans-European network. Now we have an opportunity to strengthen, to relaunch trans-European network. And what is the reaction? In the best case, reluctance. In the worst, formal opposition. This is another mistake, a lack of vision, frankly speaking. Thank you.